The metal detector didn't beep. The screen didn't flash. But the man in the dark blue uniform still raised his hand and stopped her, his voice sharp and cold, like steel scraping steel. "Ma'am, step out of the line, now." The security checkpoint seemed to lose all its air at once. Rolling suitcases froze. Mid-motion, a crying child fell silent. An elderly couple lifted their heads at the same time. Natalie Brooks stood still in the TSA pre-check lane, one hand resting on the handle of her carry-on, the other holding her passport. She didn't flinch, didn't protest. She simply lifted her eyes and looked straight at the officer in front of her. There was no panic in her gaze, only a controlled, icy clarity. The kind of look that usually appears right before a hostile takeover, or the moment someone realizes their position was never as secure as they believed. The digital clock above read 12:15 in the morning. Outside, winter wind slammed snow against the glass walls of O'Hare Airport, tearing at New Year's Eve like it wanted inside. Terminal 3 was packed. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone was irritated. Everyone just wanted to be somewhere else. Natalie did too. 39 years old, dark grey wool coat, low leather heels, her hair braided neatly and pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. She looked like a middle-aged American woman, finishing a year of business travel. No flash, no noise, no visible power. No one would guess how much authority was standing quietly inside that slim frame. "Is there a problem, officer?" Natalie asked. Her voice was calm, level, unshaken. The officer looked her up and down. His eyes lingered a beat too long on her hair, on her plain leather bag, on shoes without a logo. His mouth curled slightly. "Random check." He said it without looking at the screen. The name on his badge read, Brian Cole, 45 years old, 10 years with the SA, slight hunch in his back, thick shoulders, a stiff neck, the eyes of a man used to giving orders and rarely being questioned. He snapped on a fresh pair of latex gloves, the rubber popping softly but sharply, like a warning. Natalie stepped out of line. She felt the weight of eyes pressing into her back, some curious, some sympathetic, some relieved it wasn't them. An older man behind her muttered under his breath, "Every damn holiday." His wife tugged his sleeve and shook her head. "Don't get involved. Not worth it." Natalie heard everything. She even heard her own breathing, steady and controlled. Brian Cole pointed at her matte black carry-on. "That yours?" "Yes." "Put it on the belt." Again. She didn't argue. Not out of fear, out of understanding. Small power feeds on reaction. She placed the bag on the conveyor. The scanner hummed. No alert. Brian said nothing. He leaned in close to the screen, squinting, searching for something that wasn't there. 1 second, 2, 3. Silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "Bag check," he announced loudly, making sure the surrounding passengers heard. "Step over here. Hands where I can see them." Natalie glanced at her watch. 12 to 28 in the morning. Boarding in less than 20 minutes. She moved to the stainless steel table. Brian didn't search the bag. He violated it. Silk blouses tossed onto cold metal. The toiletry bag squeezed hard until cream leaked out. Her laptop flipped and turned in his hands like a meaningless object. "Heavy computer," he said. "What do you do?" "I run a tech company," Natalie replied, her voice dropping half an octave. Brian let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Consultant." "Sure." A young woman stood nearby, badge reading Emily Carter, 27 years old. She stood straight, but her shoulders were tight. She avoided Natalie's eyes, avoided Brian's. Her gaze flicked nervously toward the growing line behind them. She swallowed when Brian dropped Natalie's running shoes onto the pile of clothes. "Pack it up," Brian said, already turning away. No apology. No second glance. Natalie folded her clothes. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was tight. Not from shame. From anger. A deep, cold anger that didn't need volume. She grabbed the handle and walked away. She had gone only a few steps when Brian's voice snapped behind her. "Ma'am, grey coat." "Stop," Natalie turned. "Me?" Brian nodded. "Random body scan." "I'm pre-check," Natalie said. "I already cleared." Brian stepped closer. Too close. Inches between them. She smelled stale coffee and old sweat. "Computer picked you," he said quietly, his voice dropping into a threat. "Unless you don't want to fly tonight." Natalie met his eyes. This time she saw it clearly. Not vigilance. Not duty. Satisfaction. She turned and stepped into the body scanner. Arms raised. Glass doors closed. The machine whirred like an interrogation room. "Alarm!" Brian announced loudly when she stepped out. "Groin and hair." A ripple of whispers spread. Emily Carter stiffened. "Emily." "Pat down," Brian ordered. Emily hesitated for the briefest moment, then pulled on gloves. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Natalie. Natalie didn't look at her. She looked at Brian. She didn't blink. Emily's hands trembled as they moved. Natalie felt every touch. Not painful, just humiliating. Not because of skin, because of authority misused. When it ended, Brian ordered an explosives swab. Green light, clear. He clicked his tongue. "Go." Natalie turned and pulled her bag, her heart pounding not with fear but with something sharper. A decision taking shape. She hadn't gone far when a radio squawked. "Stop. Security." This time, it wasn't Brian. 2 airport police officers approached. Brian followed behind, pointing. "That's her. Theft. She stole a watch." The hallway froze. Natalie set her bag down, lifted her head. "I did not take anything." Her voice was even, low, not defensive. Brian smiled, wide, comfortable, like a man who had finally found the excuse he needed. And Natalie understood with absolute clarity that this New Year's Eve was not going to end quietly. Not for him. Not for anyone here. The first airport police officer to reach Natalie was tall and broad-shouldered, his hand hovering near his belt out of habit more than intent, while the second stayed half a step behind, eyes scanning the crowd like he was already bracing for a scene. "Ma'am," the taller one said, voice firm but not yet hostile. "We're getting a report of a stolen item." Natalie didn't move. She stood exactly where she was, the handle of her carry-on still upright beside her leg, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floor between her shoes. "From who?" she asked. Brian stepped forward before either officer could answer. He was breathing a little faster now, chest rising and falling under his uniform. But his grin hadn't faded. "From me," he said. "I saw her take it. A watch, high-end. Slipped it right out of the bin while I was checking her laptop." A low murmur rippled through the hallway. Someone gasped. A man in a business suit instinctively patted his own wrist, then looked embarrassed when he realized his watch was still there. Natalie turned her head slowly, just enough to look at Brian, really look at him. He avoided her eyes for a fraction of a second, then lifted his chin as if daring her to challenge him. "Officer," Natalie said, shifting her attention back to the police. "This is the third time he's stopped me in less than half an hour. He searched my bag. He scanned my body. He had me patted down. There was nothing. Now he's accusing me of theft." The taller officer glanced at Brian, then back at Natalie. "We're gonna need to check your bag," he said. "Again?" Natalie asked. Her tone wasn't sarcastic. It was precise. "Right here?" The officer hesitated. "Unless you'd prefer to come with us to the station." Brian chuckled, the sound sharp and pleased. "Let's do it here," he said. "Nothing like transparency." Natalie felt the eyes of the terminal pressing in tighter now. Phones were coming out. Not dramatically, not yet, but discreetly, the way people do when they sense something ugly unfolding and don't want to miss it. She knelt and unzipped her carry-on. Brian stepped closer, and with a careless nudge of his boot, knocked the bag onto its side. Clothes spilled out across the floor, dark fabric against pale tile. Someone laughed, then quickly stopped when no one else joined in. Natalie stayed kneeling for a moment, her hands resting on her thighs, her breathing slow. Then she stood. She didn't rush to gather her things. She didn't scramble. She simply straightened, smoothed the front of her coat, and reached into the inner pocket. "Hands," the second officer snapped reflexively, his fingers brushing his cuffs. Natalie paused, palm open. "My phone," she said. "I'm calling my attorney." Brian rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. We're not doing that. Not until we find the watch." He crouched and began pawing through her belongings, lifting items and dropping them back to the floor with open disdain. He shook a leather folder, dumped her toiletry bag, grimacing when nothing fell out. "Check her pockets," he said, standing abruptly. "Probably stuffed it in her coat." The taller officer looked uncomfortable now, his jaw tightening. "Ma'am, I need you to empty your pockets." Natalie met his gaze. "No." The word landed hard in the air. Brian straightened, face flushing. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Natalie repeated. "I've complied with every lawful instruction. I've been searched multiple times. You are escalating based on a lie." Brian's face darkened. "That's it," he snapped. "Cuff her." "Resisting screening. Disorderly conduct." The taller officer hesitated, hand halfway to his cuffs, uncertainty flickering across his features. Natalie looked past them, down the long corridor toward the lounge entrance, searching for something she couldn't yet name. Then she saw him. A man in a tailored suit, stepping out of the Delta Sky Club with a coffee in hand, pausing mid-step as the raised voices reached him. Daniel Wright. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him in Washington. A few more lines at the corners of his eyes, but the same unmistakable presence. Natalie lifted her voice, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the tension. Daniel. He stopped, turned, squinted. Recognition hit him like a jolt. Natalie. He moved toward them immediately, coffee forgotten, his expression shifting from surprise to concern with every step. What's going on here? Brian turned, irritation flashing. Sir, back up. Police business. Daniel ignored him. He looked at Natalie, then at the scattered belongings on the floor, then at the officers. Why is Natalie Brooks being threatened with handcuffs? He asked quietly. Brian laughed, a short bark. She stole a watch, claims she's important. Daniel's eyes hardened. She is important, he said. She's the head of one of our primary federal contractors. Brian's smile faltered. Just slightly. Yeah, he scoffed. And I'm the president. Natalie stepped closer to Daniel, her voice steady, lethal in its calm. This officer has harassed me, touched me, publicly humiliated me, and now he's accusing me of a felony because I wouldn't submit to another search. Daniel took in the scene again, slower this time, his gaze lingering on Brian. Who's your supervisor? He asked. Brian swallowed. On break. Call him, Daniel said. Now. Brian reached for his radio with shaking fingers, but the damage was already done. Natalie bent and picked up her leather folder, dusting it off with deliberate care. I'm not leaving, she said softly. Not until this stops. She opened the folder and pulled out a small black wallet, flipping it open just long enough for the gold shield inside to catch the light. Brian stared, his face drained of color. That's fake, he blurted. You bought that online. Natalie closed the wallet and slipped it back into her coat. Touch me again, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and you'll be charged with assault on a federal consultant, on top of everything else. The taller officer stepped back instinctively, palms raised. Brian's breathing turned ragged. He looked around, suddenly aware of the phones pointed at him, the witnesses he no longer controlled. She's lying, he shouted, panic edging his voice. She took a Rolex. It's in her bag. I know it. Daniel stepped between them, his presence creating a physical barrier. We're done here, he said. We're moving this to a private room. Brian's eyes lit up at the words, relief and triumph mixing into something dangerous. Room 4. B, he said quickly. Soundproof. Natalie met his gaze, unflinching. Lead the way, she said. But understand this, once that door closes, you're not in control anymore. Brian laughed, thin and brittle. We'll see. As they started down the corridor, flanked by officers, Natalie felt the air around her change. The fear was gone. In its place was focus. Cold. Exact. She was no longer a passenger trying to make a flight. She was back in a familiar role, evaluating a threat, identifying a weakness, preparing to expose it. Room 4B smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the kind meant to erase evidence rather than remove dirt. The door slammed shut behind them with a heavy metallic thud that echoed once, then died. The noise felt final. Brian Cole stood near the table, pacing, his boots squeaking faintly against the linoleum. The two airport police officers took positions by the door, uncertain, their earlier confidence replaced by the uneasy awareness that something had shifted and they were no longer sure who outranked whom. Emily Carter hovered near the wall, arms folded tight across her chest, eyes fixed on the floor as if she could will herself invisible. Natalie placed her carry-on the metal table exactly in the center, squared it, then stepped back. She didn't sit. She didn't lean. She stood with her shoulders relaxed and her spine straight, facing Brian like a quiet challenge. "Put the bag on the table and sit down," Brian ordered, his voice louder than the room required. Natalie glanced at the chair, then back at him. "I prefer to stand." Brian's jaw clenched. "This isn't a preference situation." He slammed his palm against the table, the sound sharp and sudden. Emily flinched. One of the officers shifted his weight, hand brushing his belt again, unsure who he was supposed to be protecting. Natalie didn't react. Her face remained calm, but inside her mind was already mapping the room. No cameras she could see. The mirror on the wall suggested observation, but she doubted anyone was watching at this hour. That was what Brian was counting on. "We're waiting for your supervisor," one of the officers said cautiously. Brian snapped his head around. "I don't need a supervisor to conduct a search incidental to detention." "Arrest," Natalie corrected quietly. "There's a difference, and that difference is expensive." Brian laughed, a brittle sound that cracked at the edges. "You think you're smart. You think because you've got a nice coat and some fake badge, you're better than me. I see people like you every night, walking through here like you own the place." Natalie's eyes didn't leave his. "I followed every rule," she said. "You broke them." Brian turned toward Emily. "Pat down again," he said. "Strip search if necessary." Emily's head snapped up. "No," she said, the word rushing out before she could stop it. "We can't. Not without probable cause. Not without authorization." Brian rounded on her, his face flushing red. "I have probable cause. I saw the bulge." Natalie tilted her head slightly. "You saw a bulge," she repeated, her voice cool. "Or you wanted to see one?" The room tightened. One of the officers stepped forward, placing a hand on Brian's chest. "That's enough," he said. "You're crossing lines." Brian shrugged him off. "You don't tell me how to run my checkpoint." The door opened. Alan Mitchell stepped in, clipboard tucked under his arm, tie crooked, eyes tired. He took in the scene in a single sweep, the scattered tension, Brian's agitation, Natalie's stillness. "What is going on?" he asked. Brian rushed toward him. "She's a thief, stole a watch, fake credentials, refused search." Alan turned to Natalie. "Ma'am, I'm the TSA supervisor." "I know who you are," Natalie said. "And I'm recording this." She lifted her wrist just enough for the small red light to be visible. Brian froze. "That's illegal," he sputtered. Natalie's gaze flicked to him. There is no expectation of privacy for public officials performing duties in a government facility. Alan swallowed. "Did you see the watch?" he asked Brian. Brian hesitated. "I saw a glimmer." Natalie nodded once. "We've gone from certainty to a glimmer." Brian's breathing grew shallow. "Just search the bag again," he pleaded. "One more time." Natalie looked at Alan. "If you open that bag again, you're complicit. But if it ends this, do it. Tear the lining if you have to. When you find nothing, I want his badge on the table." Alan hesitated, then nodded. He unzipped the bag, slower, more careful than Brian had been. He checked every pocket, every seam. He shook it upside down. Nothing fell but lint. The room was silent. Brian stared as if willing reality to change. "She must have handed it off," he said weakly, "or swallowed it." One of the officers rubbed his temples. "Stop," he muttered. Natalie stepped forward. "Are we done?" Alan nodded. "You're free to go." Natalie shook her head. "I'm not going anywhere." She pulled out her phone. "I've already sent a priority signal." Brian backed into the wall, eyes darting. "You're bluffing." "I don't bluff," Natalie said. There was a knock at the door. Then another. It opened to reveal Daniel Wright, flanked by two men in dark suits and a uniformed police captain. The air in the room changed instantly. Authority flooded in. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "No one leaves," he said. One of the suited men secured the door. Brian's bravado collapsed in real time. "I have rights," he said, his voice cracking. Natalie met his eyes. "You had authority," she said. "You confused it with entitlement." Daniel sat, folding his hands. "Do you know what was on the laptop you handled?" he asked Brian. Brian shook his head. Natalie answered. "Encryption keys for critical infrastructure. You detained me in a public terminal for nearly an hour." Brian's face went pale. One of the agents read from a tablet. 14 complaints, 3 settlements, pattern of profiling. Alan Mitchell sank into a chair. Daniel looked at Brian. "Why her?" Brian stared at the floor. "I didn't like her attitude," he whispered. Natalie stepped closer. "You used the authority of the government to soothe your insecurity." The words hung heavy. One of the agents moved forward. "Richard Brian Cole, you're being detained." Brian's knees buckled. As they opened the door, the sound of the terminal rushed back in. Natalie gathered her bag. She walked out first. The hallway fell quiet as they emerged. Phones were raised openly now. Brian was led out behind her, cuffs clicking. Emily stood frozen by the glass, tears in her eyes. Natalie stopped, turned to her. "You did what you could," she said. "Write it down. All of it." Emily nodded, breath hitching. As Natalie walked away, the weight she'd carried since the first command to step out of line finally shifted. This was no longer about making a flight. This was about setting a record straight in front of everyone who had ever been told to move along and keep quiet. The walk through Terminal 3 felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because every step carried weight. Natalie moved at a steady pace, her carry-on rolling smoothly beside her, the sound of its wheels a quiet counterpoint to the murmur that spread behind them. Brian Cole shuffled several feet back, hands cuffed behind him, shoulders collapsing inward, as if gravity had suddenly doubled. The airport police captain stayed close, one hand lightly guiding Brian's elbow. Not rough, not gentle, just firm. Daniel Wright walked a half-step behind Natalie, his presence a calm, immovable force, already fielding calls he didn't answer yet, already planning the aftermath. People stopped, not dramatically at first, just hesitations, a pause in walking, a head turning. Then phones came up openly, screens glowing like small witnesses. Whispers traveled faster than sound. That's him. He's the one who was yelling. What did he do? No one asked Natalie anything. No one needed to. Her posture said enough. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked straight ahead, jaw relaxed, eyes focused, every movement controlled. It wasn't defiance. It was composure, and it unsettled people far more than anger ever could. As they passed the security checkpoint where it had started, the line was completely still. Other TSA agents stood frozen behind the glass, uniforms suddenly heavy with awareness. Emily Carter was there, standing rigidly near the scanner, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When she saw Brian in cuffs, her lips parted in a silent intake of breath. Natalie slowed, then stopped. The crowd leaned in, hungry for a moment. Natalie turned toward Emily. "You followed the book," she said clearly. "That matters." Emily swallowed hard, nodding, tears pooling but not falling. "I'll write everything," she said. Natalie gave a single nod and turned away. The moment passed, but it stayed with everyone who saw it. At the edge of the sterile area, the police station doors waited. Daniel stopped beside Natalie. "We'll process him tonight," he said quietly. "Formal statements in the morning." Natalie glanced at her watch. 11:50 in the evening, 10 minutes to the new year. "I'll come in tomorrow," she said. "I have a flight." Daniel's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "Gate K-12, he said. "They're holding it." Brian was led away, his head dropping as the doors closed behind him, cutting off the sound of the terminal like a severed wire. Natalie didn't look back. She walked toward the tram, heels clicking against terrazzo, each step lighter than the last. The countdown announcement crackled over the speakers. 10, 9. Cheers erupted behind her. 8, 7. She stepped onto the escalator, the noise rising like a wave she no longer had to fight. 6, 5. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The gate agent spotted her and waved, eyes wide with recognition. "Miss Brooks," he said, scanning her pass. "Welcome." She walked down the jet bridge as the terminal exploded into the final countdown. 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year. The door closed behind her, sealing out the chaos. Inside the cabin, the air was calm, warm, the low hum of systems steady and reassuring. She took her seat and rested her hands on the armrests, feeling the vibration through the frame of the plane. Only then did the tension finally begin to drain from her muscles, leaving behind a deep, aching fatigue. Morning came quietly in Georgetown. Pale winter light spilled over the river, soft and forgiving. Natalie sat on her terrace, wrapped in a sweater, a mug warming her hands. David sat across from her, scrolling through his tablet, his expression shifting between disbelief and something close to awe. "Have you seen this?" he asked. Natalie shook her head. "Not yet." He turned the screen toward her. The video was everywhere. Her walking through the terminal, calm and composed, Brian behind her in cuffs, the contrast stark and undeniable. Millions of views, headlines, commentary. The comments rolled endlessly, stories pouring out from strangers who recognized themselves in that hallway. Natalie watched silently, not focused on herself, but on the faces in the crowd, the moments she hadn't seen at the time. Her phone rang. Daniel's name lit the screen. "They fired him," he said without preamble. "Effective this morning. Pension gone. Charges filed." Natalie nodded once. "Good, there's more." He continued. Internal review turned up missing property complaints, high-value items. He was fencing them. Natalie closed her eyes briefly. So it was never about security. "No," Daniel said. "It was about power." 3 days later, Natalie stood on the courthouse steps as cameras flashed. She spoke plainly. No theatrics. No triumph. She announced the settlement and the fund she was creating, her voice steady as she outlined its purpose. Legal support, accountability, a place to turn when silence felt safer than speaking up. She didn't mention Brian by name. She didn't need to. His absence said enough. Back at O'Hare, things changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. But voices lowered, hands moved more carefully. Supervisors watched a little closer, and every time a traveler in a simple coat walked through pre-check without incident, a few agents exchanged glances, wondering just for a second who that person might really be. Natalie knew the story would fade eventually, replaced by the next outrage, the next headline. But some ripples don't disappear. They settle into the water, altering its shape. She finished her coffee and watched the river move steadily past, indifferent to power, patient with time. Justice, she had learned, didn't always roar. Sometimes it walked quietly, carrying its own bags, waiting for the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. The first hearing was scheduled for early February, a grey morning that matched the mood of the city as Natalie stepped into the federal building downtown. The marble lobby smelled faintly of polish and old paper, the kind of place where voices naturally dropped and footsteps echoed longer than intended. She moved through security, without incident this time, her badge checked with quiet respect, the guard's posture straightening as recognition flickered and then vanished behind professionalism. Natalie noted it without comment. Respect that arrived late was still a data point. Inside the courtroom, Brian Cole sat at the defense table in a wrinkled suit that didn't quite fit anymore. He looked smaller here. Not physically, but in the way a man looks when stripped of uniform and authority. when the room no longer bends to his voice. His attorney leaned in close, whispering, but Brian barely reacted. His eyes kept drifting to the gallery, to Natalie, then away again, as if contact itself burned. She sat several rows back, hands folded loosely in her lap, posture relaxed, expression unreadable. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there to make sure the record was clean. The prosecutor spoke calmly, methodically, laying out the charges. False imprisonment, civil rights violations, abuse of authority, interference with a federal operation. Each phrase landed with quiet weight, not drama, not spectacle, just fact after fact stacking into something impossible to ignore. Evidence followed. Body cam footage, security video, internal complaints, settlements paid quietly over the years to keep similar stories from reaching daylight. Natalie watched the jurors as much as she watched Brian. Some leaned forward, some frowned. One woman shook her head almost imperceptibly as a clip replayed Brian's voice in the terminal, loud and smug, certain of himself. When it was Natalie's turn to testify, the room shifted. Not because she raised her voice. She didn't. Not because she embellished. She refused to. She spoke the way she always did when precision mattered. Clear, direct, controlled. She described the first stop, the second, the third. The way time stretched when you realized someone was enjoying your discomfort. The way humiliation felt less like heat and more like cold, seeping in slowly until it settled in your bones. She didn't speculate about Brian's motives. She didn't need to. She described his actions and let the silence do the rest. Brian's attorney tried to rattle her on cross-examination, asked if she might have misunderstood procedures, if stress could have colored her perception. Natalie met each question with the same steady tone. No, that's incorrect. I'm very familiar with procedure. When asked why she hadn't simply complied one more time to avoid escalation, she paused just long enough. Because compliance without cause teaches people like him that they can escalate forever. The courtroom was silent after that. Even the judge looked up. Outside, cameras waited. Natalie didn't stop for them. She walked past, coat buttoned, eyes forward, David at her side. In the car, she finally allowed herself to lean back, exhaling slowly. That was hard, David said quietly. Natalie nodded. It needed to be. The verdict came weeks later. Guilty on all major counts. Brian didn't look at her as he was led away. Natalie felt no rush of triumph, just a closing of a loop. Justice, when it finally arrived, was rarely cinematic. It was administrative, permanent. It altered the shape of a life and moved on. The fund took shape faster than she expected. Calls came in from every corner of the country. People who had been detained for hours, people who had missed funerals, births, last chances, people who had been told to keep quiet because it would be easier. Natalie listened to every story she could. She hired attorneys who understood not just the law, but the cost of being ignored by it. She insisted on transparency, on reports, on follow-up, on outcomes measured not in press releases, but in changed procedures and retraining that actually stuck. At O'Hare, Mandatory reviews were rolled out. Brian's name became a cautionary reference no one used aloud. Supervisors rotated more frequently. Complaints were logged differently. Not perfectly, not universally, but better. Emily Carter transferred to another department, then another airport. She wrote Natalie once, months later. "Thank you for not looking away." Natalie wrote back 2 lines. "Keep doing the right thing. It adds up." Life resumed its rhythms. Meetings, flights, long nights spent reading briefings with too much coffee. But something had shifted in Natalie, something subtle and irreversible. She noticed things she might have once dismissed as background noise. A hand lingering too long on a traveler's bag. A voice raised just a little too eagerly. She didn't intervene every time. She couldn't. But when she did, it was surgical. Quiet conversations, a name noted, a report filed, pressure applied where it mattered. One evening, months later, she stood again in an airport terminal, watching people move through security in loose waves. An older man argued gently about his belt. A teenager fumbled with his shoes. A woman in a plain coat walked through without incident, shoulders easing the moment she cleared the scanner. Natalie felt a familiar tightening in her chest, then let it go. This wasn't about perfection. It was about momentum. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. Another case settled, another policy updated. Progress, slow and unglamorous. Natalie smiled faintly and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She boarded her flight when her group was called, took her seat, and looked out the window as the plane pushed back from the gate. The engines roared to life, powerful and indifferent, carrying everyone forward, whether they were ready or not. As the city fell away beneath the clouds, Natalie closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the steady lift, the unmistakable sensation of leaving something behind. Power, she knew now, wasn't loud. It didn't need to announce itself. Real power waited, observed, chose its moment. And when it moved, it did so in ways that changed the landscape quietly, permanently, so that the next person in line might walk through without ever knowing how close the ground beneath them had once been to giving way. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between briefing memos and vendor updates, its return address stamped with the seal of a congressional subcommittee Natalie knew too well. She read it once, then again, slower, noting what it asked and what it didn't. Testimony. Closed session. Scope limited, language careful. Not an invitation. A summons dressed as courtesy. She folded the letter and set it aside, feeling the familiar tightening behind her eyes. The work had reached a point where ignoring it would be louder than answering. The hearing room was smaller than television made them look, a horseshoe of polished wood and microphones that caught every breath. Staffers moved with practiced efficiency, shuffling papers, adjusting lights. Natalie took her seat without ceremony, a slim folder placed squarely in front of her, hands resting lightly on either side. The members filed in, some curious, some guarded, one openly skeptical. The chair cleared his throat and thanked her for appearing. Natalie nodded once. She didn't smile. She had learned that smiles were often misread as permission. The questions came carefully at first. Procedures, oversight, What safeguards existed, what had failed. Natalie answered with the same precision she had used in court. She named policies, cited timelines, explained how ambiguity became a weapon when discretion went unexamined. A congressman leaned forward, pen tapping. "Are you suggesting systemic abuse?" Natalie met his gaze. "I'm suggesting incentives matter," she said. "If humiliation has no cost, it will be used." The room stilled. A staffer paused mid-note. As the session progressed, the edges sharpened. One member asked if her experience had colored her assessment. Natalie let the question hang for a beat. "Experience is how systems are tested," she said. "If they only work for people who fit expectations, they don't work." A murmur rippled and died. She felt the familiar pressure of eyes weighing tone over truth, searching for a crack. She gave them none. Outside, reporters clustered, hungry. Natalie declined comment again. She had learned that narrative traveled faster than nuance and left more damage behind. In the car, Daniel called. "They're drafting recommendations," he said. "Some will stick. Some won't." Natalie watched the city slide past. "They will if enough people keep asking the same questions," she replied. The fund's workload doubled after the hearing. Calls came from smaller airports, quieter places where scrutiny rarely reached. Natalie delegated, trusted her team, but insisted on reviewing patterns herself. She noticed how often the same phrases appeared in reports: random selection, officer discretion, non-compliance, language that erased agency while justifying force. She began tagging cases differently, cross-referencing supervisors, shift rotations, complaint outcomes. The map that formed was unsettling in its consistency. One afternoon, she met with a group of trainers contracted to redesign de-escalation modules. They were earnest, well-meaning, and out of their depth. Natalie listened, then asked them to remove the slides. "Walk me through a real interaction," she said. "No hypotheticals." They hesitated, then complied. She stopped them when the script bent toward control instead of resolution. "That's where it breaks," she said. "You're rewarding compliance, not safety." The room grew quiet. A trainer nodded slowly, the realization settling in. Travel resumed. Different cities. Different terminals. Natalie moved through them with an awareness she hadn't needed before. A heightened sensitivity to tempo and tone. She noticed how a raised eyebrow could escalate faster than a raised voice. How a joke at the wrong moment could curdle into resentment. She also noticed kindness where she hadn't before. An agent who quietly explained a delay. A supervisor who stepped in early, diffused a moment before it hardened. Progress was uneven, but it existed. In Denver, a man recognized her near a coffee stand. He didn't approach at first, just watched, uncertainty written across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "You helped my sister," he said. Natalie searched his features, then nodded when recognition clicked. "She made it home," he continued. "She didn't think she would." Natalie felt the familiar ache, the one that arrived when relief replaced fear. "I'm glad," she said. He thanked her and walked away, shoulders lighter than when he'd arrived. The call came late one night as she packed for another flight. An internal whistleblower. Not anonymous. nervous but resolute. The details were specific enough to make her still. A storage room, confiscated items logged poorly, a pattern that rhymed with Brian's, but bigger, older. Natalie listened without interrupting, taking notes by hand. When the call ended, she sat on the edge of the bed, the room quiet around her, the city humming beyond the window. This wasn't over. It never was. She coordinated quietly, looping in the right offices, insisting on parallel reviews to avoid the usual dead ends. The response was cautious, then decisive. Subpoenas, audits, interviews conducted away from familiar corridors. Natalie didn't attend them. She had learned that presence could distort as much as absence. Instead, she monitored outcomes, pushed when momentum lagged, waited when patience would yield more. At the next board meeting, a director asked if the work was distracting from core operations. Natalie folded her hands. "It is the work," she said. "Security that humiliates creates risk. Trust is infrastructure." There was a pause, then a nod. The vote passed. Months later, she found herself back at O'Hare, earlier this time, the terminal bright with morning light. She moved through pre-check without incident. An agent greeted her with a neutral professionalism that felt earned. As she gathered her things, she noticed a small plaque newly mounted near the exit. It listed passenger rights in plain language. Nothing flashy, nothing grand. She paused for a second, then continued on. On the plane, she settled into her seat and opened her folder. The work waited. Always would. Natalie closed her eyes as the aircraft taxied, the vibration familiar and grounding. Power, she understood now, wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the willingness to stay present long after the cameras left, to do the quiet, repetitive work that turned moments into systems. When the wheels lifted and the city receded, she felt the steady pull forward, the kind that didn't promise ease, only direction. The backlash didn't arrive as a storm. It crept in as paperwork. Subtle delays. Meetings postponed without explanation. Invitations that stopped coming. Natalie noticed it first in the margins, where friction always showed before it announced itself. A memo returned with comments that sidestepped substance, a budget line quietly trimmed, a contractor suddenly unavailable. Nothing overt, nothing she could point to and name as retaliation. But the pattern was there, faint and deliberate, like fingerprints wiped almost clean. She learned who was uncomfortable by who grew louder about balance, by who asked for patience in rooms where patience had been an excuse for years. One official leaned back in his chair and said, "We can't let one bad actor define an entire workforce." Natalie nodded. "Agreed," she said. "That's why we're defining incentives." The man's smile tightened. He had wanted contrition, not clarity. The next incident came from a regional airport with a single runway and a reputation for quiet compliance. A video surfaced late on a Friday night, grainy but unmistakable. A woman in a denim jacket being pulled aside, voice shaking, surrounded by uniforms. Natalie watched it twice, then a third time, without sound, focusing on posture, spacing, the way the circle closed. She forwarded it with 2 lines. Preserve footage. Suspend involved parties pending review. The reply came back slower than it should have. By Monday morning, the narrative had already begun to harden. Local officials called it a misunderstanding, a learning opportunity. Natalie read the statements and felt the familiar cold settle in. She dialed Daniel. "They're circling the wagons," she said. Again. Daniel exhaled. "I'll get eyes on it." "Get teeth," Natalie replied. "Eyes don't change outcomes." The woman in the video agreed to talk. Her voice cracked at first, then steadied as details found order. A missed connection. A raised voice. A supervisor who framed refusal as non-compliance. Natalie listened, asked precise questions, let the story breathe. When it ended, she didn't offer comfort. She offered options. Legal, administrative, public, private. The woman chose administrative first. Natalie respected that. Control mattered. Behind the scenes, resistance sharpened. An internal email circulated, anonymous but pointed, accusing Natalie of eroding morale, of criminalizing discretion. She read it once, then set it aside. Morale that depended on unchecked power was a liability, not an asset. She responded not with a rebuttal, but with data. Outcomes from retraining pilots, reduced complaints where oversight was enforced, a graph that showed correlation without rhetoric. Numbers were harder to argue with, even when people tried. At a conference in Phoenix, a panelist took a thinly veiled swipe at consultants who confuse advocacy with governance. The room shifted, eyes flicking to Natalie. She waited until her turn. "Governance without accountability is theater," she said. "Advocacy without structure is noise. We're building structure." A few people nodded, a few didn't. The divide was clean. Later that night, she stood on a hotel balcony, heat rising from concrete long after the sun had set. The city hummed below, indifferent to internal battles. Natalie leaned on the rail and let the fatigue catch up. Not the tiredness of travel, but the deeper strain of pushing against something that pushed back silently. She thought of Emily, of the woman in the video, of the people who would never call because the cost still felt too high. She stayed there until the noise inside her settled into resolve. The audit results landed in pieces. A missing log here, a supervisor override there. Not dramatic enough for headlines, but damning in aggregate. Natalie convened a call with agency leadership and spoke plainly. "This isn't about intent," she said. "It's about design. You've built systems that reward speed over dignity. Fix the design." A pause followed. Then a voice she hadn't expected spoke up, older, steady. "She's right," it said. "We've known this." The admission shifted the room. Not enough. But enough. Pressure arrived from another direction, quieter but sharper. A donor threatened to withdraw support from a related initiative if Natalie continued politicizing operations. The message was delivered politely, with concern for optics. Natalie replied with a single sentence. "Operations are political when power goes unexamined." The support vanished. The work continued. Weeks blurred. Flights, calls, long sessions with policy drafts that turned verbs into obligations. Natalie learned which words mattered. Shall instead of may. Require instead of encourage. Review instead of consider. She insisted on timelines, on named owners, on consequences. Each demand cost her something. Each gained ground elsewhere. Then came the night she didn't expect. A call from a small airport she had never visited. A supervisor had intervened early, escalated a tense exchange, documented it thoroughly, and requested feedback. Natalie listened to the account, surprised by the detail. "We used the new protocol," the supervisor said. "It worked." Natalie closed her eyes and smiled, just for a second. "Good," she said. "Write it up. We'll circulate it." At the next oversight meeting, she led with that story, not as a victory lap, but as proof of concept. The room leaned in. "This is what it looks like," she said. "Early intervention, documentation, respect." No one argued. Momentum was a fragile thing. It needed examples more than speeches. The retaliation didn't stop, but it lost coherence. Too many eyes. Too many records. Natalie understood that this was the inflection point, where systems either reverted or reformed. She leaned into process, into the unglamorous labor that outlasted outrage. When she flew, she watched. When she landed, she followed up. When she slept, it was shallow, but it was enough. On a late return through Chicago, she walked the same corridor where it had begun months earlier. The lighting was brighter now, or maybe she was. A supervisor greeted her with a nod that carried no fear, just recognition. Natalie moved on without acknowledging it. Recognition wasn't the goal. Predictability was. As she boarded, a man ahead of her struggled with his bag. An agent stepped in, helped, smiled. The exchange was small, almost invisible. Natalie felt the weight in her chest ease a fraction. This was how change announced itself, not with applause, with absence. The absence of harm, the absence of humiliation. She took her seat and opened her folder. The work was still there. It always would be. But for the first time in a while, it felt lighter, as if the system itself had shifted just enough to carry some of the load. The night the threat arrived, it didn't announce itself with violence. It came as a voicemail, clipped and careful, left just before midnight. Natalie listened once, then again. The cadence too practiced to be a drunk rant. The pauses too intentional. "You're making enemies," the voice said. "You should consider stepping back." No name. No number. The sound of traffic in the background. She saved it, tagged it, and sent it to the right place without comment. Fear was a signal, not a command. By morning, the pressure had shifted from obstruction to warning. A meeting was cancelled with no explanation. A briefing packet arrived stripped of attachments. An op-ed ran questioning the wisdom of outsiders shaping frontline practice. Natalie read it with coffee growing cold at her elbow, underlining phrases that gave away their sources. Outsider. Agitator. Risk. She recognized the tactic. Reframe accountability as interference. She forwarded the piece with a note. Track response metrics by region. See what moves. At headquarters, the mood was brittle. People spoke softly in hallways, voices dropping when she passed. Not fear of her, she realized. Fear of association. She gathered her team and said the thing no one wanted to hear. "We're going to document everything," she told them. "Every delay, every deviation, every threat. We don't escalate. We build a record." The room exhaled together. Relief and dread braided tight. Records were slow. Records worked. The whistleblower followed up with photographs, shelves, tags, items mislogged or not logged at all. Natalie studied the images late into the night, zooming in on labels, matching serials, cross-referencing times. The pattern wasn't opportunistic. It was systemic. She drafted a memo that asked for exactly 3 actions, no more. Secure inventory. Independent audit. Temporary reassignment of named supervisors. She sent it to 3 offices simultaneously. The response came faster than she expected. In a small office in St. Louis, a supervisor resigned by lunchtime. The news didn't travel far, but it traveled enough. Phones rang. Messages shifted tone. Where there had been caution, there was calculation now. Natalie understood the change. Risk had moved, not away from her, toward them. Travel resumed, relentless and necessary. In a narrow body over the plains, turbulence rattled cups and nerves. Natalie stared at the wing flexing against cloud, thinking about structures designed to bend without breaking. On landing, she found an email flagged urgent. A union grievance. Language sharp, legalistic, accusing her work of endangering members. She read it twice, then forwarded it to counsel with a single line. Meet them. Not to win. To listen. The meeting was tense but honest. Voices rose, then steadied. Natalie asked questions that shifted the frame from accusation to outcome. Where had interventions helped? Where had they failed? A veteran agent spoke up, reluctant but earnest. "We don't want to hurt people," he said. "We want cover when we do the right thing." Natalie nodded. "Then let's build cover," she said. It wasn't agreement. It was alignment, fragile but real. The voicemail went public anyway, leaked to a blogger hungry for drama. Headlines flared and faded in a single news cycle. Natalie didn't respond. She focused on the work. A pilot program launched quietly in 3 airports. Clear criteria, clear escalation paths, clear consequences. The metrics surprised even her. Complaints dropped, intervention times shortened, missed flights decreased, safety incidents held steady. Dignity improved without compromising security. She shared the data with no commentary. It spoke for itself. At a regional summit, an official approached her during a break, voice low. "You're not wrong," he said. "You're just early." Natalie sipped her water. "Early is where prevention lives," she replied. He nodded, thoughtful. When the session resumed, his questions were different. So were others. Late one evening, she received a call from Emily. They hadn't spoken in months. Emily's voice was steadier now. "I got promoted," she said, almost apologetic. Natalie smiled. "Good," she said. "What changed?" Emily hesitated. "Someone listened," she said. "Because they had to." Natalie closed her eyes, relief warming her chest. "Use it," she said. "That's the point." The threats tapered, replaced by silence. Silence could be strategic. Natalie treated it as such. She requested audits when quiet stretched too long. She praised publicly and corrected privately. She learned which battles to fight now and which to set like charges for later. Power shifted in inches, not miles. Then came the incident that tested everything. A late-night detention, a traveler with limited English. A supervisor invoked discretion. The new protocol was followed halfway, then abandoned. The footage showed hesitation, a chance to stop that wasn't taken. Natalie watched it alone, twice, then once more at half speed. She felt the familiar cold settle. This was the moment critics would seize. She acted before they could. She called the supervisor directly. No intermediaries. "Walk me through your decision," she said. The explanation was halting, defensive, then honest. Natalie listened. "You had the tools," she said when he finished. "You chose speed." The line was quiet. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we correct it," she said, "and you explain it." The supervisor did. The apology was public, the retraining immediate, the consequences proportional. The story didn't explode. It resolved. On a flight home, Natalie sat by the window, city lights threading the dark below. She thought about the line between resolve and rigidity, about how easily certainty could harden into the thing she was fighting. She checked herself, as she did every night. Am I listening? Am I adjusting? Am I still aiming at the right target? The answers held. The next morning, a memo arrived from leadership. Expansion approved. Funding allocated. A single sentence at the end caught her eye. "We will measure what we value." Natalie let herself smile, just once. Measurement was commitment in disguise. She walked through an airport later that day, unrecognized, unremarkable. A family struggled with bins. An agent helped without being asked. The moment passed unnoticed. Natalie kept walking, heart steady. Change rarely announced itself. It accumulated. And as she boarded, she understood the risk had shifted again. Not because threats had vanished, but because the system had begun, finally, to protect the right things. The call that changed the tempo came just after dawn, when the city was still deciding what kind of day it would be. Natalie answered without looking at the number. Daniel's voice was tight, stripped of its usual measured calm. "They're pushing back hard," he said, "not publicly, through channels that don't leave fingerprints." Natalie sat up, already alert. "Where?" "Appropriations," he said. "They're tying funding to revisions. Soft language. Optional enforcement." Natalie closed her eyes for a beat. Optional meant hollow. Optional meant reversible. "Who's driving it?" she asked. Daniel named 2 committees and 1 familiar donor. Natalie wrote the names down, ink pressing through the page. Timing? This week. By mid-morning, she was in a glass-walled conference room. The city spread beneath her like a circuit board. Her team gathered, faces set, coffee untouched. Natalie didn't preface. "We're about to lose ground if we let this get diluted," she said. "So we're going to make dilution visible." She assigned tasks in clean strokes. comparative analysis, side-by-side language, impact projections, case studies anonymized but unmistakable. No speeches, she added. Receipts. The documents moved fast, too fast for the usual choke points to slow them. By evening, a draft circulated among staffers who knew how to read between lines. Phones buzzed. A meeting appeared on her calendar, then disappeared, then reappeared with a different host. Natalie smiled thinly. Pressure was a form of attention. The next day, she walked into a hearing room that felt different than the last. Fewer cameras, more watchers. People who had already decided what they wanted and were here to see if she would give it to them. The chair opened with pleasantries and pivoted quickly. "We are concerned about overreach," he said. Natalie leaned into the microphone. "So am I," she replied. "That's why we're talking about guardrails." She presented the comparison without commentary. Old language, new language. What changed? What disappeared? What returned when accountability loosened? The room grew quiet in the way that meant comprehension had landed. A member interrupted, voice sharp. "Are you threatening to embarrass us?" Natalie met his gaze. "I'm preventing you from being surprised," she said. The difference mattered. A few smiles flickered, then vanished. The chair called a recess. In the hallway, a lobbyist approached, practiced sympathy in his eyes. "You've made your point," he said softly. "There are other priorities." Natalie tilted her head. "Dignity is not a side project," she replied. "It's a prerequisite." He sighed, already recalibrating. The conversation ended without a handshake. That night, the op-ed machine whirred back to life, louder this time. Think pieces bloomed and withered within hours. Natalie read none of them. She watched the metrics instead. Calls to the fund spiked, then leveled. Internal reports ticked upward where protocols held and flagged red where they didn't. The map sharpened. A surprise ally emerged from an unexpected corner. A former administrator, long retired, released a statement that cut cleanly through the noise. It wasn't fiery. It was factual. It named history. It named God. It named the difference between discretion and dominance. The statement circulated widely among people who mattered and quietly among those who feared being named next. Natalie sent a brief thank you. The reply came an hour later. "Keep going." The breakthrough arrived not as a victory, but as a concession, framed as compromise. The language returned, stronger than before. Shall replaced may. Independent oversight restored. Timelines fixed. Natalie read the final draft twice, then once more out loud, listening for traps. There were none she couldn't live with. She sent a single word to Daniel. Approved. The vote passed without drama. That was the point. Natalie watched the tally appear, then disappear behind the machinery of procedure. She didn't celebrate. She closed the folder and moved on. Systems didn't care about satisfaction. They cared about maintenance. Weeks later, she stood in a training room watching a scenario unfold. An actor raised his voice. An agent mirrored, then stopped himself. A supervisor stepped in early, used the language Natalie had fought to preserve. The tension eased. The scenario ended. Applause did not follow. Natalie nodded once. Again, she said. Repetition made habits. Habits made culture. At a small airport on the coast, she observed quietly as an elderly woman struggled with a bin. An agent offered help, waited, explained, never touched without consent. The woman smiled, relieved. Natalie felt something loosen in her chest. This was what success looked like. Invisible. The case that would have broken the old system came late in the year. A complex alert, high stakes, conflicting directives, the protocols held, decisions were documented, oversight engaged early. The situation resolved without spectacle. Natalie read the after-action report twice, then set it down and stared out the window at the river moving steadily past. She thought of Brian, of the night it began, of how easily power had slipped into cruelty when no one was watching. She thought of Emily, of the supervisor who had chosen differently, of the thousands of travelers who would never know why their day had gone smoothly. That anonymity felt right. Her phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. "You changed the frame," it read. Natalie typed back. "We held it still long enough for others to see." She slipped the phone away. On a flight home, turbulence rattled the cabin. Natalie watched a cup tremble on a tray, then settle. She smiled to herself. Stability wasn't the absence of movement. It was the ability to absorb it without spilling what mattered. As the plane smoothed and the lights dimmed, she closed her eyes, already thinking ahead to what would need attention next. The work was not done. It would never be done. But it was standing now, on its own feet, able to carry more than one person's weight. The quiet that followed felt earned, not empty. Natalie noticed it first in the absence of alarms, in the lack of late-night calls marked urgent, in the way her calendar stopped reshuffling itself at dawn. The system was holding. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but enough that the work had shifted from triage to stewardship. She spent more time reading reports than responding to crises, more time refining language than repairing damage. It was a different kind of vigilance, slower and steadier, the kind that required patience rather than adrenaline. On a cold morning in Chicago, she walked the familiar corridor one last time before a long stretch away from travel. The lighting hummed softly. The floor gleamed. The place looked ordinary again. That was the measure. Ordinary meant no one was being singled out. Ordinary meant procedures were working. She paused by the plaque listing passenger rights and traced a line of text with her eyes. Plain language. Clear promises. She moved on without ceremony. The fund's annual report landed on her desk later that week. Pages of outcomes, charts showing declines in complaints where protocols were enforced, narratives anonymized but human. She read everyone. She lingered on a story about a father traveling with a child who needed extra time, about an agent who waited, explained, made space. She closed the report and set it aside, feeling the weight of something lighter than victory and heavier than relief. Responsibility. At a small ceremony that didn't invite cameras, a group of trainers thanked her for insisting on the unglamorous work. Natalie thanked them back and reminded them that credit belonged to those who showed up when no one was watching. Applause would have cheapened it. They shook hands and went back to their jobs. That evening, she called Emily. They talked about mundane things, weather, schedules, a promotion that came with new pressures. "It's harder," Emily admitted. "But it's clearer." Natalie smiled. "Clarity is kindness," she said. They said goodnight and hung up. The news cycle moved on, as it always did. Other outrages, other heroes. Natalie didn't mind. The work she cared about thrived in the shadows, where consistency mattered more than recognition. She learned to enjoy the anonymity again, to move through spaces without being read as a symbol. Symbols burned out, systems endured. On her last flight before a long break, she took a window seat and watched the wing cut through cloud. The cabin was calm. A child laughed 2 rows back. An attendant moved quietly down the aisle. Natalie felt the steady hum and let her shoulders drop. She thought about the night it began, about the sound of a door slamming and the way fear had sharpened into resolve. She thought about how easily that resolve could have hardened into something else if she hadn't listened, adjusted, shared the weight. When the plane landed, she stood with the others, patient, unremarkable. Another traveler heading home. At the exit, an agent smiled and said, "Have a good night." Natalie returned the smile. "You too." The exchange lasted a second. It mattered. Outside, the air was cold and clean. She walked to the curb, pulled her coat close, and breathed. The city moved around her, unaware and unconcerned, which was exactly the point. She had learned that justice didn't always arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it arrived as routine, as predictability, as the quiet confidence that came from knowing where the lines were and why they held. Natalie unlocked her door at home and set her bag down. She poured a glass of water and stood at the window, watching lights blink on and off across the neighborhood. Tomorrow, there would be emails. There would be decisions. There would be moments that tested the system again. But tonight, there was this. Stillness without fear. Silence without threat. She allowed herself to rest in it, not as an ending, but as proof. If this story stayed with you, pass it forward. Tap like, subscribe for more, and comment below now.